In 2021, the BBC reported that 1 in every 42 children born was a twin, with 1.6 million being born worldwide each year. According to the scientific journal Human Reproduction, this rate of twin birth was higher than ever before, with a drastic increase in every region of the planet over the preceding 30 years. The BBC article went further to say that, with changes in childbearing trends and medical treatments, 2021 may even have been the peak of twin births. That same year, PQ published a survival horror game called Tormented Souls, developed jointly by studios Dual Effect Games and Abstract Digital, a game for which both the science and the folklore of twins and twin births are extremely relevant. If you're watching this and aren't already an aficionado of horror games, and survival horror in particular, then you may not have heard of Tormented Souls before. When playing both it and its 2025 sequel on stream, I was asked quite a lot what the game was called, and received quite a lot of comments remarking that people hadn't heard of the series before. Virtually anyone with even a passing familiarity with video games can recognise Resident Evil or Silent Hill games at a glance, whereas identifying Tormented Souls requires a much more specialised knowledge of the survival horror genre. Whilst understandable, this is also a great shame. Not only was Tormented Souls one of the best games, horror or otherwise, to release in 2021, but it was also one of the flagships, alongside the likes of Alyssa, Signalis and Crow Country, of the survival horror renaissance of the past 5 years. I would even go so far as to say that this series, now that there's a sequel, is a titan of the modern genre, more than worthy of being mentioned in the same breath as Resident Evil and Silent Hill. This game, alongside Signalis, was most directly responsible for 2 die-hard Resident Evil and survival horror fans, Will Penkiman and myself, setting up the Horror Game Awards. The excitement that I felt at the reveal of a sequel has been matched only by the news that Resident Evil 9 has a release date and it will be returning to Raccoon City. Without a doubt, one of the reasons for the excitement around the original Tormented Souls, along with other extremely well-received survival horror games of recent years, is nostalgia. I, like many others, grew up playing games just like this in the era of the PS1, GameCube and PS2. And as the generations passed, it became so much harder to find games like these. Even Resident Evil strayed far from its origins and into third-person shooter territory, while Silent Hill dropped off the radar entirely. So yes, there is absolutely nostalgia, in the sense of longing for something that we have lost. But too often, nostalgia is used as a pejorative, the implication being that we love it only because we grew up with it, and that it faded away as a result of being outdated, eclipsed by superior, modern game design. Even back in the golden age of survival horror, this attitude not only existed, but was relatively mainstream. I forget which magazine I read it in, but a distinct memory that has stuck with me since the early 2000s was reading an article about Resident Evil Code Veronica and the suggestion that the series' formula had grown stale. A sentiment echoed by RE4 director Shinji Mikami, who said, "I remember playing Resident Evil 0 and said to myself that this is just more of the same. This is why I wanted to change the system. With the new system, I once again feel nervous and scared when I play it." It's certainly true that there's a lot of positives to modern gaming and the technological advancements that have come over the years. When playing a third-person shooter with an over-the-shoulder camera, it's not difficult to tell just how far things have moved. Even looking at the original versus remake of Resident Evil 4, the gameplay comparison is night and day. Likewise, the advances in areas like accessibility and customization, which allow gamers to tailor the experience to their particular needs rather than being flatly excluded, are absolutely welcome. But it does not follow from this that everything which can be labelled as modern is positive, nor that design choices which originated from technical limitations, such as tank controls or fixed camera angles, are automatically outdated. Discussing the broader trends towards homogenization in video games, particularly in the AAA space, is an essay in and of itself. For our purposes, it's simply enough to note that what passes for modernity in many games is simply the narrowing of horizons. I would argue that the Tormented Souls games stand as a demonstration of that. A game that very definitively modernizes survival horror in a technical sense, whilst utilising classic design choices in ways that more than demonstrate their worth when the limitations that necessitated them originally no longer exist. The original Resident Evil was intended to be first person, but had fixed cameras because, with the pre-rendered 2D backgrounds, it allowed for an increase in the detail on screen as well as the polygon count of the characters. It's now possible to have fully realised 3D environments with incredible levels of detail alongside high poly characters and many enemies. But those fixed cameras also bring with them a cinematic atmosphere that many so-called cinematic games cannot boast. And when the cinematic combines with the uncertainty and fear factor, such as when you run down a dark sewer tunnel with the camera keeping several steps ahead of you, you get that sense of impending dread you might feel when watching such a scene in a horror movie. Amplified because you're in control and you will have to react to the emergence of an unseen threat. Playing through Tormented Souls, and especially Tormented Souls 2, it is impossible to deny how beautifully haunting all of this looks. The way that the camera angles best complement the long shadows and the flickering lights that illuminate the game, and the tension racked up by the choice to have the camera slowly twist so that everything is not level as you try to weave through a corridor filled with spinning traps. The camera angles make it easy to get turned around in narrow, twisting and claustrophobic corridors. But if the cameras mean you struggle to navigate or get lost easily, then aside from the map, the tank controls on the D-pad are your best friend. Up is always forward, so you don't have to get yourself turned around just because the camera angle switches, as you might with camera relative controls. At the same time, the left stick does allow you to move relative to the camera, and faster. So while you can use the tank controls to navigate around a winding set of narrow corridors, you can also switch to the stick controls if you need to quickly dodge past an enemy, whether just to get out of the room or whilst maneuvering in a boss fight. Both setups serve their purpose, and even complement each other, in a way that has been done before, including on the HD remaster of Resident Evil Remake, but which the enemy and level design absolutely leans into. If you don't fully explore your surroundings, then you will likely struggle to have the resources you need for combat, possibly even miss clues that are integral to solving a puzzle and progressing. If you engage every single enemy, you'll be out of ammo fast, and potentially struggle for health items too, especially if you engage by simply shooting as they advance upon you, not working with the space around you to keep your distance. The second game has a much greater variety of enemies to contend with, both stronger enemies who do a lot of damage and pose a challenge to kill, and weaker ones whose strength comes from the numbers and the risk of backing you into a corner or catching you between them so that you have no way out. And these creatures are no shambling zombies. Well, there are shambling zombies, but even they move relatively fast and with deadly intent, necessitating the dexterity of the modern analog stick controls to maneuver past them unharmed. If you decide to take them on instead, then smart use of different available weapons, switching between gun types and melee to do the most damage with the least expenditure, is a must, as is making use of the dodge function available while aiming. Your inventory isn't limited in these games, but your resources are, and whilst it's certainly possible to take out everything in your way in areas you may need to backtrack through, and even to have an abundance of ammo following this does require smart play. The puzzles will tax a different part of your brain, requiring the deciphering of often limited or obscure clues alongside lateral thinking. But that need to pay attention to your surroundings remains, as there's no yellow paint marked anywhere, and your character will not blurt out any hints as to what you can do. The game trusts the player to figure it out for themselves, and to mull the problem over if they get stuck, because this is a central tenet of the gameplay loop, rather than an afterthought as a way to break up combat sections. The first game quickly became notorious for difficult puzzles, sometimes for the logic that applied to their solution, and other times because many people would pick up a clue but not associate it with the puzzle it was meant for because it felt too disconnected. There was also the requirement of real-world knowledge, such as in the floppy disk puzzle, where you had to know what was necessary to overwrite and to write protect a floppy disk. In the second game, there's a puzzle that provides a clear context clue about moves in chess, but does require you to know what each piece in the game actually looks like in order to apply the clue. It's always going to be difficult to balance puzzle difficulty to be challenging, but not utterly grind gameplay to a halt. Different survival horror games will approach it in different ways, depending on the emphasis that they choose to put on puzzles. Survival horror veterans can point to the water sample puzzle in Resident Evil 3, or the piano puzzle in Silent Hill, as among the trickier ones within the genre. But this has always been part of the fun. Puzzles aren't for everyone, and an appeal to a more mainstream disinterest in truly thought-provoking puzzles with interesting mechanics might explain why AAA games so often relegate them to simple busy work to break up combat, where the protagonist or an NPC basically yells the answer at you if it stumps you for more than a couple of seconds. But for a survival horror game, the puzzle serves a far more useful purpose. You might have to backtrack and explore to find crucial clues, or fetch an item necessary to complete the puzzle, feeding again into the pressure on the player for smart resource management and tactical decisions on when to leave enemies alive or take them out. And even when the puzzle is self-contained, having to exercise your brain to make it work provides a more authentic way to break up different sections of the game that isn't mere busy work. For those who get genuinely stuck, completely and utterly, the answers are far more accessible now than they were in the days when you had to buy a physical guide from a store, call an expensive hotline that would make your parents yell at you about the phone bill, or hope that a friend who also had the game had gotten past that part. What's important here is that, as commonplace as it might be, there is no legitimate case to call the mainstream approach to puzzles modern, especially when we're talking about a specific genre of gameplay. And that's what the current renaissance of survival horror games represents. It's too easy to look up the term survival horror, or to read a list of the best survival horror games as published by a gaming outlet, and think it simply means horror where you're able to shoot the monsters. The alternative being walking simulator and hide and seek simulator horror. There's nothing wrong with action horror games, and there are plenty of great games in that space. Survival horror is something else, rooted in non-linear exploration, backtracking, resource management and puzzle solving. It's hard to find in the AAA space of 2025, to the degree that I think a mention of Resident Evil 7, RE2 Remake, Alan Wake 2, Silent Hill 2 Remake and Chronos The New Dawn counts as a comprehensive recap of the past decade. But in the indie space, this genre is absolutely thriving. In 2025 alone, we can list off The Mute House, Dead of Darkness, Post Trauma, Heartworm, The Lacerator and Tormented Souls 2 as great entries to the canon. Dead of Darkness, Heartworm and Tormented Souls 2 in particular standing in masterpiece territory. And that's just the games that I, personally, have played. At least 18 other survival horror games have released this year. And while many modern survival horror games affect the retro aesthetic in homage to the games that inspired them, this is not a prerequisite for being enjoyed by fans. Nor is it any kind of proof that the genre as a whole is outdated. All of the strengths of the genre that we've already discussed are wrapped up in horror stories that leave a lasting imprint on the player. Resident Evil's cheesy dialogue in the early days is a meme.
Whoa! What is it?
What? Oh no! Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
The product of translation and localization issues. But its narrative, about a faceless corporation unleashing horror and destruction on small-town Americana, is a lasting inspiration for a reason. Likewise, the more personal, psychological horror of Silent Hill 2 in particular. In the modern era of cinematic, story-driven gaming, the best survival horror games are precisely that. From Alan Wake 2's Twin Peaks-inspired surrealist high art, to the deep cosmic horror mystery of Signalis, to the knowing, tongue-in-cheek grindhouse comedy of The Lacerator, there's plenty on offer. The cerebral, the silly, occasionally the both at once, but never the forgettable. The Tormented Souls games tell the story of Caroline Walker, as she uncovers the truth about her own identity and a mysterious cult responsible for Frankenstein-like human experiments in the service of dark gods. They offer up a tale that's rooted in the cosmic horror ethos of our world being only a thin veil over the unknown and unknowable horrors, in the face of which humanity is insignificant, beyond helpless. But the true villain of the tale is mankind's hubris, occultism mixed with mad science. And navigating both this world and the other not only makes for some very interesting puzzle mechanics, but also a way to defy destiny in favour of freedom. There's plenty of cheese in the dialogue, horrific atrocities in the backstory that we learn as we progress, and a story that, whilst tapping into these themes, is above all fun.
Good luck. You're gonna need it.
For those of us who grew up with survival horror games on the PS1, it may never be possible to fully recreate the feeling of playing those games for the first time. But to see the genre alive and growing, bringing in new generations, without either falling back on cheap clones of the classics, or losing its identity to homogeneity dressed up as modern game design, that comes pretty close. Which is why a franchise like Tormented Souls needs to be celebrated. Proof and a reminder that there's space for classic survival horror in the current era of gaming, and it can evolve and remain relevant without bowing to cheap trend chasing or becoming another generic shooter. Thank you very much for watching. This is my very first video on a brand new channel, so I greatly appreciate it if you've enjoyed the video, if you could give it a like and be sure to subscribe. You can get early access to future videos on both this and my other channel by joining my Patreon for as little as £1 a month. Thank you again for watching, and see you next time.
You're crazy. But thank you for not getting me killed.
Anytime.